Welcome to Therapy Explained, where we explain, demystify, and destigmatize mental health and mental health treatment. My name is Deniss. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and your very own mental health cheerleader. Today, we're going to be talking about ways in which your mother and father wound might be showing up for you at work. Now, you're probably already aware if you have a mother wound and a father wound. And today I want to try to highlight some of the ways in which you might not notice it coming up at work. It's easier to identify when it's coming up with your friends, with your family, maybe even in romantic relationships, but much harder at work because we tend to think of these as completely separate spaces. But the truth is that you're always you, and you carry with you your experiences in whatever space you're in. My work is specialized in working with BIPOC professionals, first and second gen BIPOC adults here in California. We talk a lot about their experiences with becoming a professional, with seeking out higher education, and trying out to balance their identity as a professional, what that even means for them, and how to balance that out with their family, their cultura, what comes before them. So what tends to come up in those conversations, however, is when we talk about the stress, the anxiety, the imposter syndrome at work, we can always trace that back to the mother or father wound. So to help you start maybe some of that work, let's get started with some ways in which the mother or father wound may be showing up for you at work. Validation. Now, validation is perfectly normal for everyone. We all need some sort of validation. Without feedback, then we don't really know where we stand or how we're doing, so it's kind of a very normal need. But when your mother wound is being activated, that need might be heightened. And when I speak about validation at work, I'm not just talking like in general, like, oh, for someone to acknowledge that you're doing well, but sometimes we might even hyper-focus on authority figures. We know that our father or mother wound is being activated because we are extra sensitive to the feedback from maternal or paternal figures at work. This could be a direct manager, someone who might be 2 or 3 levels above us, maybe even a colleague that represents that for us. Now, remember, validation, feedback, necessary, kind of really normal. Most of us need it to some degree. But when we notice that someone's feedback feels extra hurtful or extra important in some way, it could be that our parent wound is being activated. That means that we are projecting those feelings onto that person and holding that person as if they were our parent in some way. You might also notice that it's hard to receive feedback in general, even though you know that it could be helpful when it's done appropriately, of course. As we know, we don't always get that feedback in the best, most respectful manner. But when it is, and when it's well-meaning, you might still feel like defensive or hurt or judged. And in those moments, it can be really helpful to ask ourselves, am I reacting to the way that this feedback was given, or am I reacting to the feedback in general? It's just really hard for me to receive it. And that's okay. Neither one of those answers is wrong. If the feedback, it could be a bit of both, right? The way that the feedback was given is what makes it triggering. Providing feedback in return to that person, if you feel safe enough to do it, can also be helpful in letting them know, hey, when I get feedback, this is the best way to give it to me. And remember, you do not have to tell people it's my father wound or my mother wound, and I'd really appreciate it if you were kinder. But just, hey, I receive feedback better in this way. And ideally, if you have a good manager, they're able to hear that and meet you where you're at. Trouble setting boundaries. When your mother or father wound is being activated at work, you might be noticing that it's hard for you to say no. Parent wounds usually come from abandonment or abuse or neglect in some way, whether that was physical or emotional. And that creates a fear in us to stand up for ourselves and an ability to stand up for ourselves, because oftentimes that wasn't received in the most appropriate way. And sometimes even it might have been punished for us to speak up. So if that was the case, that means that speaking up for yourself or saying no at work feels wrong. It feels like you're not supposed to be, especially if you were socialized as a woman, particularly as a Latina woman or a woman of color. It's also very likely that you were raised not to say no, that you were supposed to please people, appease people, make room, be nurturing towards other people, and not say no. So that's another aspect of what might be coming up for you on top of that parent wound, a feeling like if you do say no, you'll be rejected, abandoned, or left behind in some way, unliked, and that can be really scary. What's best for us to practice when we're struggling with boundaries, when our parent wound is being activated, is to again practice some of that self-reflection and ask ourselves, what's coming up for me and what do I need to soothe myself in this moment? Whether that's some affirmations and reminding ourselves that we have every right to say no, to protect our energy, to protect our space, and make sure that we are present and feeling safe and healthy at work just as much as anywhere else. Or practicing maybe some self-soothing, like going for a walk or journaling or deep breathing. So learning those things usually happens in a space like therapy. If you're interested, make sure to look at those links down below. But many things could be helpful in this moment. That self-reflection, and then that soothing, and then ultimately, yes, practicing some of those healthy boundaries, like saying no, which I know can be really hard and scary. And don't worry, I'm coming up with a series on boundaries, or at least a video on how to set boundaries at work, and just boundaries in general as well. But I know that it's scary to say no, so one really easy step to get started could be saying yes, but. So starting off tasks, finishing tasks, or letting people know that yes, you can do this, but you can only do it at this time, or it can be completed at this time. So that's an easy way to practice those boundaries without having to say no just yet if that's too scary. Imposter syndrome. I have videos on imposter syndrome. We've talked about how race plays into imposter syndrome, the fact that minorities tend to experience imposter syndrome at greater rates than non-minorities. All of that is important to note as we're also talking about this point. But the mother wound or the father wound also comes into play in a situation like this when we, most likely, if we have our parent wounds, are feeling like we are not enough. Again, the parent wound is usually connected to abuse, neglect, or abandonment in some way, whether that's physical, psychological, emotional. So if that has happened to us already, it's most likely that our self-esteem, our sense of worth, our ability to cheer for ourselves, to celebrate for ourselves is very low and very limited. So when we are going into a space at work and accomplishing things, it might be hard for us to recognize that, to celebrate that, to be able to say, I'm good at my job, I deserve where I'm at. That is so hard for us when we've had that parent wound. In communities of color, it can be also really difficult for us to celebrate ourselves because that's also not necessarily common in our communities, in our culture, to cheer ourselves on in that way. Humility itself is very much a value that if you're saying that you think you're good at your job, then you're just bragging, right? Where is that line between being confident and overly confident or narcissistic? And it's important for us to, be able to differentiate between the two. But saying I'm good at my job is not the same thing as saying I'm better than everyone. That is a very different message. So it's okay for you to practice celebrating small wins. And that's a very good, small way to start healing that for yourself, is that when you do well at something, that you can celebrate yourself in some way, whether that's by sharing it with friends so that they can also in return say, yay, congratulations, or maybe saying you know what, to celebrate at the end of the day, after work, I'm gonna go get some coffee, I'm gonna go get my favorite dessert, I'm gonna go visit my favorite place, I'm gonna play some of my favorite music on my way home, I'm gonna cook my favorite meal. So whatever it is that would feel celebratory for you in a small way can help you practice that positive reinforcement that you most likely did not receive growing up because of your parent wound. So these are just some of the ways in which the parent wound might be showing up for you at work. And I know that it might be a little overwhelming to realize, like, oh my gosh, a lot is happening. But it's okay. This is a perfect start. Self-awareness is always the first step to making changes. If we don't recognize that it's happening, then we're not going to be able to address it at all. So self-awareness is the first step. After that, really deep processing and self-understanding is next. If you're ready to take that step, make sure to check out some of the links down below. I offer therapy at my practice, but there's also really great therapists out there. If you're not in California, even if you're in California, there's so many out there. I encourage you to take that step so that you can practice some of this stuff. I know that you don't typically think, well, I want to do better at work, or I want to do better in my career, or I kind of just want to have better relationships, and therefore I should probably go to therapy. I know we tend to think of therapy as necessary for severe chronic mental health, and yes, absolutely, but it doesn't necessarily need to get to that point for you to seek support. So I hope that this video was a really good start for you to start identifying some of these things. Practice some of the stuff that we talked about and see how that feels. But if you need some extra support, I have some resources for you down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. As always, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Give it a thumbs up if you found it useful, helpful, if you felt that you learned something. And, comment, share as you please, as it feels natural for you. And yeah, again, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, I'm always cheering for you.